The sky had been a weary grey all day, a silent promise of a rain that never quite arrived. Yet as the sun dipped beneath the horizon, casting the forest in deepening shades of twilight, there was something oddly still about the air, an absence of the usual rustling whispers and chirps that marked a living wood. The couple, Maria and Ethan, had driven for hours before finally reaching this forgotten corner of wilderness, far from city lights and the incessant noise of their everyday lives. They sought escape, refuge in the wild, a chance to breathe beneath a canopy untouched by time. Setting up their small green tent beneath the skeletal arms of towering pines, Ethan moved with practiced hands, tension hiding beneath his calm exterior. Maria watched the shadows gathering at the edges of the clearing, the way they flickered and danced as the last rays of light fought through the thick canopy. She felt the pulse of the forest like a living thing, an ancient heartbeat pulsing just beneath the skin of the world, and it sent a shiver crawling along her spine. It was peaceful here, yes, but in that peace, a weight lingered, something silent and waiting. The fire they built cracked and hissed, sending tiny sparks skyward to vanish into the dark. They sat close, warmth seeping through the chill of the night. Words came and went in quiet fragments, but neither felt the need for conversation. There was a gravity in the way shadows pressed inward, thickening as the night deepened, as if the darkness were gathering strength, folding around them like a tightening noose. Maria's eyes kept drifting beyond the ring of firelight to the black outline of the forest, where unseen shapes seemed to lean closer, listening. The stars began to prick the sky, cold, distant pinpoints of light, indifferent to the small dramas unfolding below. She thought of how fragile their presence was here, how quickly a careless step might vanish into the wild and never return. Ethan's face was calm, but she could see the tightness at the corners of his eyes, the set of his jaw. He was trying to be strong, for both of them, but she sensed the doubt beneath the surface, the uneasy feeling she herself could not shake. The woods were ancient, and not all its secrets were meant for human eyes. As the night deepened, the air grew colder, more still. Even the usual night sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of a squirrel, were absent. It was a silence that wrapped around them, dense and heavy. Maria reached for Ethan's hand, the small comfort of contact anchoring her to this moment, to the only familiar thing in a wilderness that felt suddenly vast and unknowable. Then came the sound. It was not immediate, but at first a distant rumble, low and trembling, like a growl rolling over the hills. Ethan stiffened, eyes narrowing as he strained to catch the source. Maria's heart hammered loud against her ribs. The sound grew deeper, rougher, an animal's roar, primal and terrifying, echoing from the shadowed depths of the forest. It was a bear, or something like it, she thought, but the noise was wrong, too close, too fierce, too desperate. Neither spoke. They sat frozen as the growling rose to a roar, breaking the stillness like a living thing stalking toward them, hungry and relentless. From the darkness, the brush snapped, the cracking of twigs under pounding feet. They heard it then, a heavy, guttural breathing, the sound of something massive moving with terrifying speed and intent. Panic clawed at them. Without a word, they scrambled to their feet, abandoning the fire, their belongings left behind in the sudden urgency to run. The forest seemed to close in, branches reaching like fingers to snag and slow them. The ground beneath was uneven, roots catching their feet as they fled blindly into the unknown night. In their frantic escape, they stumbled out of the forest and into an open expanse where the darkness was thick but no longer oppressive. Only endless rows of towering corn stalks, rustling faintly in the night breeze. The cornfield stretched out around them, a maze of green shadows and whispering leaves rising impossibly high above their heads, swallowing them whole. Breathing hard, hearts pounding with exhaustion and dread, Maria and Ethan stopped. There was no light except the faint glow of stars, no sound but the soft murmur of corn leaves brushing against each other. The forest and its terror were behind them, but the vast, silent sea of corn was something else entirely. Here, the sky above was a fragile thread of light suspended over a world swallowed by green darkness. They looked at each other, fear now mingled with disbelief. There was no path through the field, only endless rows that seemed to stretch beyond the horizon in every direction. The corn towered so high, their eyes could not peer over it to the edges, to safety. The couple stepped forward hesitantly, swallowed by the stalks, the rustling rising to a ghostly chorus that seemed to whisper secrets beyond understanding. Behind them, the forest's roar faded into silence, replaced by the creeping dread that something unseen had followed them here, watching, waiting. And in that moment, with night pressing down and the cornfield closing in, the true horror began to unfold. The moment they stepped into the cornfield, a suffocating silence swallowed them whole, thick and unnatural, pressing against their ears as if the very air had thickened, deadened. The comforting sounds of the forest, the crackling of dry leaves, the distant call of nocturnal birds, were gone, replaced by a ghostly whispering as the corn stalks brushed against one another, swaying gently in a breeze they could neither see nor feel. Every step forward was met with a soft, eerie rustle that seemed to multiply, filling the space with a hushed, sinister chorus. Maria's breath came fast and shallow, her chest tight with the raw ache of fear. She glanced back once, and all she saw was an unbroken sea of rustling corn, the forest swallowed up behind it as if it had never existed. Ethan's hand tightened around hers, but even that small contact did little to quell the rising panic that clawed at her throat. The field was impossibly vast. The stalks stretched so high their heads disappeared into the night, a tangled, impenetrable wall. Then, faint at first, but unmistakable, a low guttural rumble began to rise from the depths of the field, curling around the stalks like a malevolent breath. It wasn't the bear anymore. No, this was something different. The sound had a strange timbre, neither fully animal nor wholly unnatural. A feral roar that vibrated through the soil beneath their feet, shaking the air, shaking them. Ethan stopped, pulling Maria close, his eyes wide and darting in the dark. The shadows among the corn seemed to deepen, twisting into shapes that flickered just beyond the corner of their vision. Something moved in the periphery, too swift and silent to be seen directly, but undeniably there. They could feel its gaze, heavy and deliberate, crawling over their skin like icy fingers. They turned to run, but the rows around them no longer seemed ordered or predictable. The path they'd taken was gone, replaced by a twisting labyrinth of green giants closing in, guiding them deeper into a nightmare from which there was no escape. Each step became more uncertain, their movements jerky and frantic. The rustling around them grew louder, closer. Maria's mind raced, a chaotic storm of dread and confusion. Her legs ached, her lungs burned with the cold night air, but she couldn't stop, couldn't slow down, not when that terrible roar rolled through the field like a storm, relentless and enraged. She swallowed the bitter taste of fear, trying to steady her breath, but the primal terror had taken root, a poison deep in her veins. Somewhere behind them, a sudden crack, like the snap of a thick branch, shattered the quiet. Ethan froze, his body rigid, every muscle coiled and ready. Maria's fingers tightened involuntarily around his arm. They heard it then, a heavy footfall, deliberate and slow, crashing through the undergrowth, closer, closer. Whatever was out there was no longer just a sound. It was a presence, stalking them, hunting. The couple stumbled, desperate to find any sign of an opening, a break in the endless green wall. Their hands slid over the damp, rough leaves of the corn as they pushed forward blindly. Faces slick with sweat, hearts pounding deafeningly in the quiet night. The sky above was a thin silver thread, distant and uncaring. There was no moon, no guiding light, only the oppressive dark and the ceaseless roar. At one point, Maria tripped, her body falling hard onto the moist earth. Pain flared in her knee, sharp and hot, but she forced herself up, driven by the raw terror that screamed in her mind. Keep moving, don't look back. But as she scrambled forward, the roar exploded again, closer, more furious, echoing through the corn like a beast enraged. Suddenly, the field was alive with movement. Shadows darted between the stalks. Figures, or tricks of the night. Their shapes were grotesque, elongated, impossible to clearly see. But Maria swore she caught glints of eyes, reflecting a cold, unnatural light. The rustling became a frenzy, as if the corn itself was alive, bending and twisting to trap them. Ethan grabbed her hand again, pulling her upright and forward with desperate strength. But the terror had begun to crush their minds. Every turn seemed to lead deeper into the maze, every breath filled with the scent of damp earth and decay. The roaring grew louder, merging with the pounding of their hearts, until it seemed the entire world was consumed by a terrifying, ceaseless noise. And then, a sudden silence. The roar cut off like a snapped thread. The shadows froze. The field fell still. Maria gasped, chest heaving, eyes wide, trying to pierce the dark. But in the eerie quiet, another sound took its place, a soft, dragging noise, slow and deliberate, coming from all around them. Something was moving closer, stalking through the rows, moving just beyond the edge of their vision. They were not alone. The silence that followed was worse than the roar. It pressed down on Maria and Ethan with a weight that made their skin crawl and their breaths shallow and uneven. Every nerve in Maria's body screamed to run, to escape. But their legs felt like lead, their movements sluggish and uncertain, as if the cornfield itself were holding them in place. Ethan's grip on her hand tightened, grounding her just enough to stop her from falling into sheer panic. The rustling had stopped, but the sense of being watched, hunted, was overwhelming. The dark shapes among the stalks no longer darted but stood still, waiting. Waiting for what, neither of them could say. The air tasted bitter with fear. Maria tried to peer over the corn, but the stalks were too tall, a towering wall of green and shadow that swallowed the moonless sky. Only the faint shimmer of stars above offered any sense of direction, but the rows twisted and turned in impossible angles, leading nowhere familiar. The labyrinth seemed alive, shifting subtly as if it breathed with some terrible intelligence. A sudden chill ran down Maria's spine. She recalled old stories whispered in small towns, stories of cornfields where people vanished without a trace, swallowed by the land itself. How the fields became traps, endless and unyielding, hiding unspeakable things beneath their leaves. At the time, she had dismissed them as folklore, but now those stories felt like warnings, real and urgent. Ethan pulled her forward again, voice low and strained. "We need to find a way out," he said, though his words sounded hollow even to his own ears. They moved cautiously, each step sending waves of rustling through the corn. The shadows stretched and flickered, forming grotesque shapes, figures bent and twisted as if forged by nightmare itself. Maria's heart thudded painfully as she fought the urge to scream. Time lost meaning in the endless green maze. Minutes stretched into hours, or so it felt. Every turn led them deeper into the field's cold embrace, and with every step, the dread grew thicker, heavier, sinking into their bones. Their footsteps left faint impressions in the damp earth, but the moment they looked back, the path behind them vanished, swallowed by the swaying stalks as if the field was erasing their presence. Then came the whispers. At first, they were just soft, barely audible sighs drifting through the rows like the wind, but soon they grew louder, closer, curling around Maria's ears with chilling clarity. The voices were indistinct, broken fragments of words that seemed to scrape against her mind, pulling at dark corners of memory and fear. She clutched Ethan's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, voice trembling. He nodded, eyes wide and scanning the darkness. It's like the field is talking." And maybe it was. The whispers twisted into a maddening chorus, a cacophony of voices rising and falling with no clear source. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, beneath the ground, from the shadows, from the stalks themselves. Each breath Maria took felt stolen, each heartbeat a drumbeat in a rising storm of madness. Ethan reached into his pocket, fumbling for his phone, but the screen remained stubbornly black. No signal, no light, just an empty void. They were utterly cut off. Panic surged anew. They quickened their pace, stumbling over tangled roots and thick soil. The whispers turned into laughter, soft at first, then rising in shrill crescendos that made Maria cover her ears, tears streaming down her face. She wanted to cry out, to scream for help, but her voice felt trapped, swallowed by the oppressive field. Suddenly, Ethan stopped. pulling her back with alarming force. "Look," he hissed. Maria's eyes adjusted to a faint, unnatural glow emanating from deeper within the field. It was subtle, like a thin thread of light weaving through the darkness, but unmistakable. Moving toward it felt like their only choice. As they pressed forward, the temperature dropped sharply. Their breaths became visible puffs of mist, floating and dissolving into the dark air. The stalks around them shimmered faintly with dew, glistening cold as if the field itself was weeping. The glowing light led them to a small clearing. Here, the corn stalks grew thin and brittle, their leaves torn and twisted, curling like the fingers of a dying thing. The ground was littered with broken twigs and strange markings. Deep scratches etched into the earth in circular patterns, jagged and raw. Maria knelt, brushing aside loose soil to reveal prints. Large, uneven, and unlike anything she had ever seen. They were clawed, elongated, almost human but distorted, unnatural. Her stomach twisted in nausea. Something monstrous had passed here. Ethan looked around nervously, eyes flickering to the shadows just beyond the clearing. "We're not alone," he said softly. "And whatever's out here, it's hunting us." A sudden rustle from the edge of the clearing snapped their attention. They spun around, backs pressed against each other, hearts pounding in deafening rhythm. A dark figure emerged, a silhouette barely visible against the night, taller than any man, limbs long and awkwardly bent. Its eyes gleamed with cold fire, reflecting a terrible intelligence. The air filled with a rancid, earthy smell, the scent of decay and something older, something wrong. Maria froze, terror rooting her to the spot. Ethan reached for her, but the figure vanished into the corn, swallowed by the darkness as silently as it had appeared. The field had claimed its guardians. The maze was alive, the shadows watching, waiting, and Maria and Ethan were caught in its merciless grip. The clearing was little more than a brief, cruel respite, an empty pause in the relentless terror that clung to every breath Maria and Ethan took. Their bodies trembled, not just from cold, but from the knowledge that something unseen prowled the labyrinth of corn around them. The figure they had glimpsed had vanished like a shadow swallowed by the night, but its presence lingered, a weight pressing against their minds, twisting the darkness into something suffocating. Maria's skin crawled as the whispers returned, but now they were sharper, more urgent, a chorus of broken voices that seemed to speak in tongues no human should hear. The rustling of corn around them morphed into sinister murmurs, as if the field itself had grown sentient, hungry, watching with a patience that spanned centuries. The lines between the natural and the unnatural blurred, and the forest's roar from the night before felt like a distant, lesser menace compared to the creeping dread now devouring their thought. Ethan's face was pale and drawn, his eyes flickering between every dark movement beyond the stalks. Their hands were locked tight, but Maria could feel the tremor beneath his grip, the terror buried deep where neither dared to speak it aloud. They had entered a place that did not welcome intruders, a place where the rules of reality bent and cracked, where escape was a fading hope. The air grew thick with the scent of wet earth and rot. Maria's breath came in ragged gasps, her mind swirling with images, faces twisted in agony, shadowy shapes lurking just beyond the edge of sight. She wanted to scream, to run, to tear through the endless rows of corn, but every instinct screamed that running was useless. The field had them. It was a predator, patient and relentless. Suddenly, Ethan stopped and raised a finger to his lips. Maria followed his gaze. A subtle movement in the stalks, a soft snapping of a dry leaf. The unseen watcher was close, closer than before. The rustling grew louder, circling them like a slow, deliberate dance of death. Maria's heart pounded so fiercely it felt like it might burst. Time fractured into disjointed shards, moments stretching thin and long, then snapping tight like brittle glass. The stars above offered no guidance. The sky was a fragile veil over an infinite cage. And then, the chase began. A sudden rush of movement surged from all sides, a force invisible but undeniable, pushing them forward, deeper into the maze. The whispers morphed into howls, animalistic, mournful, filled with hunger and rage. Maria stumbled, falling hard onto the cold, damp earth. She tasted dirt and felt the cruel sting of thorns scraping her skin as she clawed desperately to her feet. Ethan was there, pulling her up, voice harsh and urgent. "We have to keep moving, no stopping." Their flight was frantic, reckless, a desperate scramble through rows of towering corn that seemed to close tighter with every passing second. The ground beneath their feet turned slick with mud, roots snared their ankles, and the air grew colder still, sharp and biting. The howls echoed all around, a symphony of menace that pressed upon their very souls. Maria's mind fractured under the weight of fear. She saw fleeting shapes in the shadows, long limbs, twisting forms that vanished when looked at directly. Eyes, dozens glowing eyes, pierced the darkness, watching, waiting to strike. The field was alive, a labyrinth of horrors that warped reality, folding space and time until every direction led only to more terror. They burst through a narrow opening in the stalks, only to find themselves trapped against a dead end, walls of corn rising impossibly high and thick. Ethan's breath came fast and ragged, his eyes wide with despair. The unseen presence was closing in. A chilling silence fell. Then, from the shadows, came a low growl, deep and guttural, resonating from all sides at once. The earth seemed to tremble beneath their feet. Maria pressed herself against Ethan, clutching him like a lifeline, even as dread seeped into her bones like poison. And then, movement. Slow, deliberate, closing in. The shadows shifted, revealing glimpses of shapes too dark to name, too twisted for the mind to hold. The growl grew louder, a beast's hunger filling the night. Maria closed her eyes, bracing for the end. But the stalks around them suddenly exploded in a frenzy of movement. A cold, piercing wind swept through the field, scattering the whispers and howls into silence. The dark figures recoiled, retreating into the endless green maze, disappearing as if they were nothing but nightmares fleeing the dawn. For a moment, just a moment, the world fell quiet again. Ethan looked at Maria, eyes full of questions, fear, and something darker, something that no words could capture. They were still trapped, still lost in the cursed field, but for now, the hunt was paused. Yet the field waited, patient, unyielding, eternal. Dawn never came, or perhaps it did, but only as a faint, cold promise swallowed by the oppressive green walls that held Maria and Ethan captive. Hours or days, time lost all meaning within the endless cornfield, a prison of shadows and whispers, twisting their minds until reality itself began to unravel. Their bodies ached from exhaustion, their spirits frayed by the merciless hunger of fear. The chilling stillness that greeted them after the night's desperate chase was a fragile illusion. It was not peace, but a breath held in the throat of something terrible, waiting patiently for its prey to weaken, to falter. Maria's fingers trembled as she clutched Ethan's hand, searching for the last flicker of hope in his pale, hollow eyes. The whispers had returned, softer now, almost seductive, drawing them deeper into the maze. They spoke in a language older than memory, a chant woven from the rustling leaves and the soil beneath their feet. The field was alive with voices, ghostly, sorrowful, and cruel, and each step they took echoed with the promise of oblivion. They stumbled into a clearing that seemed impossibly familiar, yet utterly alien. The earth was cracked and dry, the corn stalks blackened and twisted as if scorched by fire. In the center lay their tent, torn and collapsed, its fabric shredded by unseen claws. Around it, deep, clawed footprints circled like a grotesque shrine. Maria's heart hammered with sickening dread. This place, their campsite, had become a monument to their disappearance. They were ghosts here, caught in a waking nightmare from which no one would awaken. Ethan knelt by the tent, tracing the tracks with trembling fingers. "They're not from any animal I know," he whispered, voice breaking. "Whatever's out here, it's something else." Maria shivered as the field around them began to stir, the stalks bending and twisting with unnatural grace. The shadows lengthened, growing thicker, heavier, solidifying into shapes that flickered at the edges of her vision. Eyes glinted in the darkness, cold and merciless. The whispers grew into a chant, rising in a dreadful crescendo that filled the air with a suffocating presence. Maria wanted to run, to scream, but her legs refused to obey. Ethan gripped her hand tighter, his strength a fragile anchor against the rising tide of madness. From the swirling shadows emerged a figure, taller than any man, its form shifting like smoke and shadow. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, an ancient predator from a world beyond time. Its eyes burned with an unholy fire, fixing on them with cold hunger. Maria's breath caught in her throat. The creature spoke, its voice a twisted echo, a sound both human and monstrous. Words in a language forgotten, dripping with menace and despair. They tried to back away, but the cornfield shifted again, the rows closing in like jaws. Escape was impossible. The creature advanced, and the world seemed to tilt, darkness swallowing everything. Then, nothing. No screams, no struggle. Just silence. The next morning, the forest rangers found the tent. Empty and torn, surrounded by strange footprints and a silence that weighed heavy on their hearts. No sign of Maria or Ethan, only the endless cornfield, stretching out under a cold, indifferent sky. And in the rustling leaves, if you listen closely, you might still hear the whispers, waiting for the next lost souls to wander into the maze.